Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another episode.
Working on OpenShift
and sometimes we haven't.
This is so awesome.
Are an open culture that
it's actually a big piece of the component for your GitOps work.
Everybody has something that they can say.
On top of the Red Hat portfolio.
Welcome to In the Clouds. I'm your host, Stu Miniman, and happy to have a special pre-Amazon reInvent show. We're going to be talking about cloud computing, of course, on In the Clouds. Going to be digging in specifically to open source. Open source has been around for a number of decades. I remember when it first came out, it was the transition from free software to talking about open source. It has gone through a lot of changes over those decades, and the big question we're going to look at today is, with cloud computing, what does it mean for open source? And really happy to welcome to the program my first external non-Red Hat guest, Jerry Chen. Jerry and I have both lived through a lot of these changes. Just in case you don't know Jerry, he's a partner at Greylock, very well-known venture capitalist firm. And Jerry's resume just is one of those things that, if you had drawn up, a successful tech person, you start with your undergraduate at Stanford, you get your MBA at Harvard, and then, he worked at VMware. The term virtual desktop infrastructure started with Jerry. Cloud Foundry, he open sourced it. And then he goes on as part of the V Mafia, investing in all of the companies. He's the guy that funded Docker. So, I would not be sitting where I am today, working in the cloud group at Red Hat, if it wasn't for what Docker had done. And he's invested in a number of companies. I've had the pleasure of knowing Jerry for a long time. I've interviewed him many times back at Docker Cons and Amazon reInvents and the like. So, Jerry, thank you so much for joining me, and great to see you.
Stu, thank you for having me. I don't know who you're talking about with the intro, but it's a pleasure that I could be here and not that other guy.
Yeah. Well, no, that is awesome. So, Jerry, we've got a lot to talk about. You wrote a bunch of articles. I've loved, since you've been a VC, every once in a while you put out these, nice thoughty pieces with the framework and how you're thinking. Before we get into all the cloud and open source discussion, maybe tell us a little bit, your role today. What's, where do you invest? What's your investment strategy at a very high level?
Sure. Thanks, Stu. Like you said, partner at Greylock. I typically do early stage enterprise software. So we're talking Series A, Series Seed. I try to go in early, back great founders in amazing markets. Sounds easy, but it's actually really hard because markets are, and we'll talk more about, they're big, they're dynamic, they're changing a lot. And just finding these world-class founders that either have a point of view on what the world should look like, or have some deep technology or an open source project, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well. And then try to go in early, be a partner to these founders. And so I do everything with cloud software like Docker, Cato Networks, Rockset in the database space, Chronosphere in the observability space, then SaaS applications, Blend, mortgage software, Gladly, customer support software, Instabase, kind of document workflows. So all things up and down the stack I look for. And, it's been fun. It's been a Greylock 8.5 years now. Feels like just yesterday. You and I were at VMworld,
Yeah, no, it's amazing. So, and you said it's easy to say, just find great people and, bet on them and everything. But, the technology, the open source piece, let's get into the big topic of open source. I think back, talking to Paul Moritz, many years ago when Pivotal got moved out of EMC and VMware, and was like, why are you doing open source? And his response was, we can't, it's moving so fast. We have no choice but to be there. And I mean, Paul was longtime Microsoft guy and was not necessarily like, yay, open source. It was like, hey, that's the way it is today. And that's how we're going to do things. What's your general thinking about the role of open source in the IT world? And, how's that been changing in the last decade or so?
Yeah, I think Paul had this insight that he repeated to me at VMware when we were building Cloud Foundry was, open source more or less has natural network effects, right? Like all platforms have natural network effects. And so to get Cloud Foundry as a piece of software that's relevant in the world. And look at Docker, you look at database software or operating systems like Linux. Getting more developers means more work on the project, which means the project accrues more value to the customers and has that virtuous cycle. So the insight there was open sourcing Cloud Foundry was needed in order to build natural network effects to kind of win that piece of open source platform or service. So I think, fast forward, 10 years later, gosh, it's been over 10 years since we did Cloud Foundry. And you look at what's happened now, both in open source as a way to build software, and more or less open source as one, right? Open source is your browser, is in your iPhone or Android phone. It powers the cloud, it powers your database. So one, open source as a way to build software has won. The number two, the great transition the past couple of years is cloud and mobile. Cloud as a distribution mechanism to get software into your hands has won, right? And so, these things aren't necessarily two separate trends. They're related and tied so close together that both open source as the fundamental way software is built today and cloud as the main way software is distributed today are the trends of the past 15 years.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to watch, Jerry. Back when I just got to sit back and watch all of these players here. I mean, you watch Microsoft, who was, the definition of a proprietary company, now is, very active in open source. Over half of Azure is now running on Linux. They partner with us at Red Hat. Google, of course, open sourced a number of technologies, and Amazon has had an interesting relationship when it comes to open source. There was a narrative a few years ago that open source from a development standpoint, but cloud has killed the monetization of open source, because you'll make something open source and they will just deliver it as a service. It feels like that has changed in the last year or so, but let's love to get your input and thoughts as to that relationship with the cloud players, against the cloud players, their participation in both the creation of open source and the monetization aspect.
Look, I think open source is a way software is built. It's not a business model, right? It's I think people kind of lump these things together. So let's separate the two. So open source is the way software is built, shared, distributed, collaborated on. And then business models are different ways to sell the product to the market. And there could be things like support for on-premise software. It could be things like distributed through the cloud as a SaaS service. So it's not just open source that had to change the business model. It's all software, Stu, right? It's, look what happened. Siebel in the CRM space to Salesforce.com. That's cloud. And arguably, there's open source underneath Salesforce.com, but the way SaaS has changed application software like CRM has changed as well. VMware, a company I worked at for almost 10 years, that was proprietary software. The way VMware needs to monetize has changed the past 10 years, now working with all the big cloud providers. So open source, again, companies like Red Hat or MySQL that Oracle bought, or more recent companies like Kafka, Confluent, HashiCorp, Docker, et cetera. Now the way those companies monetize, either A, selling on-premise open core products or support, right, depending upon your flavor of productization, or number two, selling a cloud hosted version of your product. So all of a sudden, the flywheel that I described in some of my blogs, thank you, like castles.com or greylock.com/castles, is there's a problem awareness, solution awareness trial. Before, you had a problem in an open source solution and you tried it by downloading the software and you ran it on your own laptop or own data center. That can still happen with a lot of open source, right? You discover the product in GitHub, whatever, or a Slack or Discord community. Now you get from discovering the technology, learning about it on Discord or whatever, downloading it. But oftentimes, instead of downloading or running it, you just click run it in the cloud. And there's a free or cheap version hosted in the cloud. So all of a sudden, Stu, the line between open source and cloud hosted proprietary SaaS blurs. Like look at MongoDB as a great example. Started as open source, still is open source, but people were downloading, a container of MongoDB. Now Mongo Atlas, their cloud hosted version, is entirely in the cloud, is a cloud service. Still got a lot of open source, but there's a lot of non-open source stuff around MongoDB Atlas, because that's how they actually run the software. And so the value, quite frankly, has changed, not just of the software bits itself, but a lot of value in cloud is how you operate it, how you run it, how you scale it, how you secure it, how you support it. And a lot of that stuff in the open source world or the cloud world today is not necessarily open source. A lot of that's proprietary, closed, or IP.
Yeah, I want to. You made a really good point. Something that we actually say at Red Hat too. You need to separate that. What are you creating, and then what's your business model? Our CEO Paul Cormier says we are an enterprise software company. We just happen to have an open source development model. Jerry, when it comes to understanding that nuance between how I develop and how I sell. For years, everybody would said, well, when is there going to be the next Red Hat of something? We were the first $1 billion, open source company. We're still the only multi-billion-dollar open source company. We had some, amazing IPOs, peers of us in the industry, GitLab and HashiCorp, both went IPO'd, both sitting around $200 million of revenue, which is great and a great growth rate. But, we always felt, and I talked to Red Hat for years, and now being here, we are so focused on being open source. Hashi and GitLab are very similar in that aspect. But as you said, a lot of other companies, it's like, well, there's some open source, and then I wrap around it. It's open core, or I create different models. Some of our largest growth areas right now are the cloud services, where we have, an SRE team, and we manage all that. But the software is all open source. So when you're working with the companies that you have, how do you help them work through that? What is free? What do I pay for? Freemium is tough. Our friends at Docker, had, millions and millions of people using it, but that monetization path was a challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you can argue that Red Hat was the first, maybe only $1 billion in revenue. I think there'll be multiple companies out there that will be billions soon, Stu. You can argue Amazon Cloud is open source company and well over $1 billion in revenue, right? Look at, what underpins, S3, EC2, Elasticsearch, et cetera, on Amazon is all open source. So, I think that you mentioned Red Hat's own business model managing open source now for your customers. Those models are starting to blur, right? So what is an open source company? What's not an open source company? It's on some spectrum from, pure support and download the bits and write me a check to like, hey, I'm going to write it for you in the cloud. And, Amazon's all over here. And increasingly more and more of the software companies and startups I work with are over here, right? And the key is like, you got to look more like a cloud service, not just because, you're trying to compete against Amazon, right? And we talk more about how Amazon, Google, Azure, and the rest are now monetizing open source, like we talked before. But also, it's how customers want to consume the software, And it's all of a sudden the API-fication of the cloud, right? Everything now isn't just a repo that you can download. Now everything wants to be an API. So all of a sudden, you have this programmable cloud, for lack of a better term, where there are a bunch of open source bits running the cloud. You can call via an API or whatever, and just run your database, run security software, run your analytics software. So look at companies I'm involved with, like Chronosphere and Rockset. Both have tons of open source. Rockset's a real-time database, call it like real-time Snowflake. Chronosphere is observability at scale, like Datadog, Prometheus, etc. Both have a lot of open source in them, but their main form of monetization is running as a service, like a SaaS company. And increasingly, we're directing most of the startups in that direction. Not always, right? Certain companies, regulatory industries, insurance, finance, et cetera, a lot of that still has to be on-premise, in my data center, et cetera. More or less, they're like government clouds, there's VPCs, and so that model, again, is blending. But more or less, we're guiding our companies to look more like a cloud company than it is, call it, Red Hat circa 2004, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does make sense. Here at Red Hat, we've been talking about open hybrid cloud for about 11 years now, but, you're right. Where did Linux start? Linux started in the data center. Jerry, I said, Red Hat might be the company that is most associated with Linux, but, you would not have Google if it wasn't for Linux. You wouldn't have Amazon if it wasn't for Linux. Where I might, parse with you a little bit as to your characteristics from an Amazon standpoint is Amazon is probably one of the best at monetizing open source. How many billions of dollars do they do a year that is open source related? they contribute. We partner with them. We love to see them embracing open source more. I sure wouldn't call them an open source company, nor would I if I talked to the new CEO Adam. I don't think he would characterize them as an open source company. But that is as it may. You talk about how you partner with the cloud providers. Your Castles article really have some good discussion of this point, because going into reInvent, it's what's Amazon going to announce, what are they going to blow up a certain category, or will there be some key partners that are now less relevant? So how do you make sure, where do you attack, where do you partner, where do you stay away from the giant castles of the big three? As you write in articles.
Yeah, I was sitting at Amazon keynote every year. Their VCs and founders waiting to see what shoe is going to drop this year, And I'll be honest, I'd say Amazon getting to a category today is good and bad, right? Is competition. They own the top of funnel, right? They own the developer credit cards. But in many ways, Amazon in a category's validation, this category is legitimate, right? Because Amazon, as you know, Google, Azure included, are so customer focused, so customer oriented. So the fact that AWS or Azure or Google saying, hey, analytics matters, or real-time databases matter, like Snowflake, is kind of validation that customers are out there. So I think there's a couple ways you work and compete. So it's always this complicated dance, if you will. In many ways, you have to kind of leverage the strength of the clouds. You're probably built on the clouds, right? So as all startup, you're probably using S3, EC2, or whatever services at Google Azure equivalent. You're trying to get into their marketplace as distribution, right? Because again, the cloud folks have top of funnel, and we can talk about how open source lets you have top of funnel. Because if you own an open source project, you own a community, then they start with you, not with Amazon. So I think open source as a community strategy, the community does have to be open source. Community could be closed source, whatever. But if you own the community, that's a even better top of funnel to monetization. So one, you got to try and leverage Amazon's strength there. And number two, you compete head on in different ways, right? I'm not afraid to fund companies competing head on against companies or services, Amazon, Azure, or Google. Look at Snowflake versus Redshift, right? Look at Confluent versus Kinesis. There's examples of companies out there that are building services that are complete competition to Amazon and doing well. We talk about Mongo Atlas versus DocumentDB, right? So there's plenty of space out there to either A, innovate around intellectual property, deep IP, B, owning a community and audience of the developer. It doesn't need a developer. It could be a practitioner, right? A data science persona, right? I'm involved in a company called True Era. If you own the data science persona, maybe you can monetize them. Or C, trying to do some jujitsu where basically you say, hey, I'm going to basically own the distribution from Amazon and leverage their technology to get to my customers. And it's an awkward dance, and it's fun because it changes every year and changes every quarter. And so the ways you compete with Amazon today, leveraging them, competing with them, avoiding them, that's going to change year to year. And so I think the pace of innovation, the pace of startups, as you do from your time on in your seat, just watching founders, speaking founders, and speaking CEOs come by, the pace of innovation has accelerated. The dancing is going faster. The pivoting is faster. And I'm excited because I still think there's plenty of white space to compete against the clouds.
Yeah, it is exciting times. It feels a little different than some of the other waves that we saw, Jerry. There were certain times where, are you going to get escape velocity and go public? Are you going to go get acquired? You look at somebody like Amazon, they are very judicious as to where they make acquisitions. It's not like you look at it and say, oh, hey, we built something great that is incremental what Amazon is doing. It would feel like there's more of a chance that Amazon will find some way at chipping away at your value proposition rather than buying you. At the same time, valuations, I'd love your comment on these, because I don't know, I look at some of these valuations and I'm just like, hey, just to take it out of our space so we don't get in trouble, look at the EVs that are going on right now. Tesla stock, a complete rocket ship. Rivian came out and, in its first week of trading is worth $160 billion. And I think there's 16 of them actually on the roads right now. So, and it's an amazing, cool truck. And even a partner of Amazon's, I got to see one in person at an Amazon show, and it is really cool. But, I can't wrap my head around it. Maybe it was my econ professor when I did my MBA, taught me certain practices that aren't in place anymore. So, what is, the path for the startups, going public versus getting acquired, some of that dance that goes on, as you said, that's a little bit different in this cloud era than it was in the past.
Yeah, look, valuations in both private and public are higher than they have been for. Multiples are higher than have been for. They haven't I can't really comment intelligently on the public market like you do. If I could talk about the stock market and the multiples, I would have a different job. I'll be behind a Bloomberg terminal trading stocks. I say the following on the bull market, why the valuations are high. It's because the investors in Wall Street can argue or becoming to realize how valuable the cloud is and SaaS is, right? And so remember when the first SaaS companies went public, Workday, Salesforce, ServiceNow, et cetera, the street didn't really understand the power of recurring revenue, the advantage of SaaS had. And all of a sudden, I think as SaaS companies and cloud companies now are going public increasingly, both private and public, we see that these markets are bigger than we've ever imagined. Two, the model of SaaS and cloud is stronger, more resilient for a bunch of reasons, right? You're collecting better data, you have more intimacy with the customer. And so the valuation, the multiples are going up because we realize that these cloud companies and SaaS companies can keep growing and growing. The past 2 years during COVID has showed that. What's been the most anti-fragile part of the economy the past 2 years? It's been tech, right? All of a sudden, we're working behind a camera on Zoom or Teams all day. We're ordering food via Instacart or Uber Eats or DoorDash, right? All that stuff's based on the cloud. And all of a sudden, when you're buying products through e-commerce and Shopify or Amazon retail's business, you realize, holy cow, one, the technology powering these business models is incredible. And two, these markets are bigger and bigger. So the bull case, Stu, you would say is, investors, myself included, Wall Street investors as well, and in the public markets are realizing that these markets are bigger. These business models are better, more resilient, more sticky when they're subscription based, and therefore going higher in price. That said, to your other question, going public versus M&A, et cetera, some of the old line companies do not have the same 100 times multiple that some of these startups do. And so can they do M&A at these prices? I don't know. Or is going to be all IPOs at these prices? I don't know. It's not for me to decide and figure that out. My job as a Series C, Series A investor is trying to get at that inception moment, the idea moment, the ideation moment of these companies, and get them on the right track towards an IPO. And hopefully, the street recognizes the value. But like all things, it does take time to basically, connect the story of the company to the Wall Street perception of the story. And who knows? I'm bullish, clearly. I'm still holding on to my stocks, right? Be it Roblox in the metaverse or gaming or Coinbase and crypto. I'm still bullish on these companies. I've been a long-term holder of Amazon stock myself, right? From years and years ago. VMware as well from years and years ago. So I'm so excited. And that's also, this is not stock advice video, so please do not take anything.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Jerry. I hear you there. One of our audience member did post in there stonks. Requisite to
yeah.
Do your own
our Wall Street Bets blog or vlog will be at the 5 o'clock hour. We'll move to that.
Awesome. We'll have the bar at the Venetian of the Palazzo. We'll have some discussions as to where we should put our bets down, and hopefully it's better than the roulette wheel. You mentioned in some of the articles you wrote about some of the technology areas that are really getting a lot of attention. So the ones I'll call out, and you're welcome to go where you are. Artificial intelligence and machine learning, definitely something we've seen at Red Hat as big growth. Tends to be very vertical focused, as opposed to back in the big data world, it was. You were a board member for Cloudera. It seemed very broad as to where it was going. AI and ML, like every industry and sub-industry has their own solution. So there's just so much proliferation there. And then the area with, I believe you said, unlimited opportunity is security, because we know at the end of the day, there's always room for more tools and more areas to help us, because there is no shortage of attacks out there when it comes to security. So I'll leave those as the two starting, or any place else that you think kind of the hot technology areas, especially, if it's open source and cloud related.
That's only a few trillion of market cap out there to talk about, Stu. Easy question. Security for sure. We can start and just comment quickly because it's so broad in the surface area. It increases, right? So there's always going to be more bad guys trying to get at information, be it, sovereign hackers or, commercial hackers. And so there's always going to be a need for more tools, right? And when you talk to CISOs and CIOs, there's an infinite budget appetite for security for obvious reasons. And throwing compliance, throwing everything else there, it makes sense. But that's kind of been an evergreen market for 2 decades. I would say AI, to your point, Stu, is super interesting because, there was a horizontal category of big data, be it Cloudera or, you can argue Redshift, Snowflake, Rockset are all horizontal technologies in terms of data, big data, real-time database, et cetera. Horizontal categories like Chronosphere and analytics and observability. But then machine learning gets more and more vertical, like you said, on purpose, because the data and the models you build have to have some domain to train on. And so one way to compete against the big cloud guys who are going to be very good at the horizontal is go vertical. So you mentioned like Rivian, right? In terms of EVs, you can argue self-driving car companies, be a Waymo or Aurora or whatever, that's the ultimate vertical in terms like the knowledge they have around roads and autonomous driving is hard to replicate in a horizontal fashion. So I think companies in healthcare have involved in one called Notable Health that's focused on healthcare machine learning. So I think machine learning breaks down to 2 categories. One, generic tools like a data robot to help you out, or a company like TrueEra in AI quality control that help you out, or verticals like healthcare, financial services, consumer personalization, where you have specific models trained around a problem set. And, I think right now, both markets are great. I think you're going to see AI baked into every single company. Security companies will all have ML, right? SaaS companies will all ML. Observability companies will all have ML. So pretty soon, I think it becomes ingredient in all these technologies. So we're super bullish on that. I don't know. What other areas of technology we look at? We look at AI, we look at security, we look at like next-gen SaaS companies, right? All aspects of CRM, HR, productivity, like next generation of, the Notions, the Airtables, the world. Figma's a company that Greylock's been lucky to be involved with, right? Those guys are doing great. So we're super excited about some of these next gen productivity tools as well. Me personally, I love cloud. I love data. I love big SaaS companies.
Yeah, and as you said, Jerry, we're talking about trillions of dollars of opportunity there, so that's pretty awesome. I saw there was an analyst recently that said that we always look at what percentage of applications live in the cloud. We were sitting somewhere 20-25%. The prediction was by the time we hit the middle of this decade, we could hit 50% of it being in the public cloud. So one of our audience members, Greg Neerman, said, hey, there's an interesting article that, somebody you and I both know, Martin Casado, wrote an article looking at, what is the opportunity cost of doing it in the public cloud versus doing it in your own data center. So you touched on some of the reasons why people keep it in their data center, but I have plenty of thoughts on, repatriation and some of those financial arguments, but I would love, your take on that.
Martin's great, and the work he did there, I think, is super insightful. But it's not really a paradox per se. He admits, I think, in a blog or a Twitter that growth is rewarded above all else. So the reason why a lot of startups go cloud first, even though it could be expensive, is $1 of growth is rewarded better than $1 a margin right now by the street. And I think the argument is at some point in time and scale, you can actually reduce your costs if you repatriate it to your own data center. And if you had better margins, Wall Street would also reward that as well, right? So I think it's a question of in your life cycle as a company, when does it make sense for you to, at some size or scale, repatriate your workloads onto the data center? And is that possible? So I'd argue that for some companies at some scale, that totally makes sense, Stu, right? You're not growing as fast and you're trying to, so a dollar of growth, like you argue you're a growth stock or your income stock, right? There's nothing in between. And so I think at earlier life stock, you're focused on growth. At some point in time, on a focus on margins and maybe repatriation or cutting costs or automating workers away is a way to do that. There's some companies I don't think it's possible. Increasingly, if you're building your cloud company first on Amazon, Google, or Azure, and you're using things like Lambda or services built there, it's going to be very, very hard to repatriate. And I know Amazon and Google and Azure are all having versions of their technology stacks on premise for you to do that for your data center. But, cloud isn't just where, it's also how. It's not just I'm located in, EC2 East or EC2 West or, Google zone in Northern Europe. It's also I have the advantage, to your point, of SREs and folks at Google supporting the back end of the stack. And so I think for some category companies, it totally makes sense to repatriate. For a bunch of companies, never makes sense to repatriate. It's just you're not the scale. You're relying too much on cloud services to build your thing, and you'd rather spend your dollars and employees launching the next product versus optimizing the cost of the second one. And all these companies have this life cycle, and once you hit some asymptotic ceiling of your first life cycle, if you're running out of growth, maybe. But dollars for donuts, I think most CEOs rather find the next curve to ride, hyper growth curve to ride, than try to optimize costs there.
Yeah, I agree, Jerry. One of the reasons I've been so bullish for many years on cloud is you get to tap into that innovation and that ecosystem that is built around it. And to your point, it's less about the where, but what could you be doing instead? So we do see all the big players extending their reach so that the public cloud isn't just US East and West and the like, but it's now coming closer and closer. We're seeing them extend their reach. Yes, their hybrid solutions getting into the data center have been a little bit of a long growth to actually mature. And as edge comes into the play more and more, can I access the same services? Can I live in those environments? So it's an area to watch. It's definitely interesting times in that space. Boy, Jerry, we've covered a lot of ground. Wondering, just step back for a second. You've now been a VC for 8 years. You said you spent about a decade at VMware. You've worked for some consulting companies in the past. When you look at new people coming to the market, what advice do you give them? I love being back at a big company. We hire interns, and many times we convert those interns into full-time people. And I love spending time with them because they're just out of school and they've used cool new technologies. And often they don't have the baggage that you and I have for being around for decades, because I need to be able to unlearn much of what I've learned so that I don't get stuck in my ways. So, what's exciting you about the next generation? What advice do you give people as to hey, here's some areas where, you need to gain experiences in these sorts of things to work at a startup or be, really valuable later in your career?
I love working in tech. You and I both have spent our careers here because I think working in technology is living in optimism, and I think you have to be an optimist to be working technology and to invest in startups, because most of these companies won't work. And, my job is saying no more than saying yes. And I love to say yes to every company, but fundamentally, when the moment I stop being an optimist about things working, Stu, and taking on Amazon or Red Hat as a startup, then I got to find something else. And so number one, I think we're lucky, and I'm very lucky and grateful to work in the job I have. Number two, for young folks coming into new jobs or technology, I always say the following: is find the smartest people and follow them. I joined VMware because it was a small company, but it had brilliant people, right? Smartest engineers, smartest product people, smartest salespeople, smartest marketers, and not just technologists, but the smartest freaking people that I ever worked with, and follow them. Number one, just follow the smart people. That led me to Greylock. And number two is don't be afraid to take risks in your career, and it's every day you have an opportunity to not just do dumb risks, but like if you want to make your way in a Red Hat or Amazon or Google or a startup, is you got to take some risks, because there's no risk, there's no reward, right? Both in your career as a founder, as an executive, and be intelligent about the risks you take and have some framework or decision criteria. But if you want to get ahead, take risks, right? Because you get noticed, you'd be successful. And I was lucky enough at VMware early in my career, Stu, to take a bunch of risks, be it build VDI, build Cloud Foundry. And every investment I make now, Greylock's a risk. And some work, some don't work. But follow smart people, and don't be afraid to take some risks.
It's great advice. I wonder, Jerry, one of the challenges with taking risks is at many big companies, if you fail, that could be detrimental to your career. You work with startups, in the Valley all the time. It's, do I have to do the pivot? So what's the role of failure in that whole discussion?
Well, two things. I'll make the plugs to do a startup because there's a risk taking is tolerated. I think for big companies, I understand the whole risk of your career failure, and I think bigger companies and smaller companies need to create a culture for risk taking. We talked a lot about Amazon, the whole the Jeff Bezos is always day one philosophy, right? So one, companies big and small should always reward risk taking, and that's a whole separate conversation I can have around leadership and culture. Number two, quite frankly, I wouldn't worry too much about that. And it's easy to say from my seat, but if you're smart and you're talented, you're not going to be unable to find a job, Stu, right? I mean, the number of open recs in our portfolio is as long as my arm times 1,000, right? So if you're a smart, talented person, you're going to find an opportunity out there. If you're around smart people and they see you're talented, they will give you more and more opportunity, even if you do fail. I failed a lot of VMware. There's a bunch of products that never worked. VMware Ace, early product, my first product, great product, really didn't work out. I lived beyond that because Diane Green, a mentor of mine, figured out let Jerry take more risks. Let's create VDI. Let's take a risk there. So one, I get the risk taking. I get the fear of your career. If you're talented and smart, there's plenty of jobs, opportunity for you out there. If you're not talented, not smart, not capable, whole separate question, then that question is, how do I get talent? How do I learn? How do I build my skills? So I'm a level of competence that I can take risks. And we talk about that separately too in career building. But, if you're working in technology and we're in this incredible boom of startups, big companies, market cap, et cetera, I wouldn't be too afraid, so don't take a risk tomorrow and blame Jerry Chen or Stu. Yeah, blame Stu, not blame Jerry. But if you're taking smart risks and you're doing decisions and you have some rationale around it and how and why, then I think people will get it.
All right. So, Jerry, final thing. Right after Thanksgiving here in the U.S., Amazon reInvent. I heard it has sold out, which means there will be 20,000 in person, which is about what it was in 2015, which is hard to believe how many years ago that was. I remember going to the early Amazon reInvents and talking to you there. I'm looking forward to being there in person. So hopefully people come find me. I'll be by the Red Hat booth a bunch and open for some meetings. Jerry, give a quick plug. Which of your portfolio companies are going to be there, and what are you looking for at the show?
I'll be there. So I just got my ticket. So two things. One, plug for, I guess, my company's Rockset, real-time database, kind of real-time Snowflake will be there. A couple other Greylock companies would be there as well. You should go to, greylock.com/castles to read more about my thoughts. Find me on Twitter at Jerry Chen. My DMs are open. So if you have great startup ideas or have friends or great founders, feel free to reach out to me. And then my email's on the website at Greylock as well, jerry.chen@greylock.com. So please look me up, follow me for more of my random musing thoughts about cloud or tech or bourbon, if you will. And then Stu, I will see you at Amazon reInvent in a couple weeks.
Awesome. Well, Jerry, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And definitely looking forward to seeing you at the show. All right. And thank you for joining me. We will have one more episode here in 2021. Hard to believe we're almost to 2022. So join me. We're going to take a break for reInvent. So it'll be 4 weeks from today. Actually going to have Brian Gracely, a good friend of mine, also here at Red Hat, does strategy, if you know him from the Cloudcast. So hope you will join me then. Let me know what guests you'd like to see in 2022, and thank you for joining me in the clouds.